Good morning, Secretary.
Good morning, Senator.
I've got some questions about, internal management of resources. What is the appropriate approach for managing changes of government from within the department?
Well, Senator, the approach to managing changes of government, can you just help me a bit? I mean, I can talk obviously about caretaker period, how we prepare briefs, those sorts of things.
Well, I guess in caretaker period, how do you go about preparing for the period post-election?
The first thing to say about the caretaker period is that we are meticulous in observing the caretaker conventions, and there's a body of work around those conventions, and we typically deal with a large number of inquiries in the course of an election campaign in accordance with those conventions. So that's part of the department's work. We also, of course, as all departments do, have teams preparing policy advice for an incoming government. And naturally, as an impartial apolitical public service, we prepare advice for any conceivable election outcome.
Okay. With that in mind, is it normal practice to, during the caretaker period, create email addresses or IT user accounts for people who are at that time shadow ministers and their staff?
Senator, as I said, we prepare hard copy incoming government briefs, and we also prepare soft copy incoming government briefs. Mm-hmm. The reality, and I know exactly where you're going, the reality in relation to soft copy briefs is that the system that PM&C has used to enable soft copy briefs to be prepared of the red and blue variety, and Ms McCourt can go to more detail if you're interested in that, but broadly in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, they can only be delivered, if you like, to an incoming minister through the creation of an email account, which is not a normal email account, it's what you'd call a shell email account. So in the modern era, in the 21st century, we wouldn't just produce hard copy red and blue books, we would also produce soft copy red and blue books, and ahead of each election we would need to create an email account for an incoming minister and potentially a staffer to enable them to receive the soft copy of the brief. I should emphasise, though, that when that is done, and was done on this occasion also, it is not an active email address. It is done entirely at the initiative of the department, and it reflects an impartial public service ready to serve whatever government should be elected on polling day.
Okay. I find that interesting because given the uncertainty of election outcomes and the time it can often take to get to the point where we have a declared result, and the fact that you've always got a prospect of reshuffles taking place post-election, I'd have thought it would be the most appropriate use of public resources to wait until the outcome of an election is clear before you move out of a holding pattern, for want of a better word, and into a preparation for the post-election era.
Let me assure you that there are no additional resources required to be ready for any incoming government. The reality is that our system, and this is a function of our Human Resources Management Information System, and if you'd like, our Chief Information Officer can come up and talk to that in more detail. But the creation of a shell email account requires 48 hours. So you'll appreciate, in order to be ready as an impartial public service for an election result of which could go either way, obviously, that's the nature of our system. We don't know the outcome until people vote and the votes are counted. In order to have been ready on the Sunday to provide an incoming government brief to a returning coalition minister, Senator Payne, or an elected opposition, an elected Labor government, we needed to be ready, and the 48-hour time frame to create these accounts obliged us to do that on the Friday evening, which we did.
What obliged you to? Can you clarify that?
The 48-hour time frame to create a shell email account to enable a soft copy brief to be delivered on the digital first system, which PM&C recommended all departments to use. So I want to assure you, Senator, there was nothing unusual about what we did. Should there have been a Labor government and an election, we would have done exactly the same for a potential incoming foreign minister. Incoming ministers typically want to access their briefs at the earliest possible moment, and that can be as soon as Sunday morning.
Did you do the same for the election prior?
That digital first platform was not available the election prior. This was the first year it was available. We would do the same next time.
I've had a look at the guidance on caretaker conventions. Nothing in there says anything about allocating IT infrastructure or indeed any other office infrastructure to set up shell offices for all of the potential people who might end up being a minister post an election. Can you tell me again where that obligation for you to do this comes from?
We are a forward-leaning department, Senator. We want to be ready for any incoming minister. There's no resources question here at all. It costs nothing to be ready, and we wanted to be ready for any potential outcome, which is what we do as an impartial public service. This sort of thing happens across the service. It just so happens particularly that DFAT's system for creating email accounts of the variety that we needed to deliver this product requires 48 hours.
So I take it from your evidence so far that you concede that DFAT did set up email addresses and profiles.
I don't need to concede it, Senator. We did it.
Okay, well then it's a fact.
It's not a concession, it is a fact.
But just to be clear, because I'm not sure that the people listening from home might necessarily understand, what we're talking about is the creation of an IT profile and email addresses for...
Senator, not an IT profile, simply a shell email account, not activated. It would only have been activated. It was never activated. It would only have been activated in the case of a change of government. And I want to be absolutely explicit that DFAT, as a department of impartial public servants, had no view on what the election outcome would be. We simply wanted to be ready, as we always will be and always are, for any outcome that the Australian people's votes might produce.
On what date were those email addresses set up?
A late evening on the eve of the election on Friday the 17th of May.
And who prompted the creation of those email addresses and accounts? Who asked for them to be created?
They were created at the initiative of my incoming government brief team. They had a discussion with me in the evening about what they had done and explained to me why it was necessary that evening to be prepared. Of course, we also had, because Senator Payne has an existing email address, we were, let me be explicit about this, absolutely ready for the re-election of a coalition government. We had put as much effort into our policy development and thinking for the re-election of a coalition government.
Did the fact that the email profile that was set up for Senator Wong described her as the minister affect the way that that email address interacted with any of your other systems?
I'm not sure that I understand the technical nature of your question, but perhaps this is the time for me to call on our Chief Information Officer.
Thank you, Senator. Tim Spackman, Chief Information Officer, DFAT.
Hello, Mr. Spackman.
Thank you. If I understand your question correctly, are you asking, did that email address affect any other systems or interact with anything else on the DFAT network?
Particularly because it had been allocated a title that had already been allocated to somebody else.
Senator, no, it did not. As the Secretary has mentioned, this was a mechanism to activate the Digital First platform so that we could deliver incoming briefs in a digital format. It had no real interaction with any other system or capability. You couldn't send to that email address, nor could you send from that email address.
Okay. So it was the incoming government team, you said, Ms Adamson,
That's correct.
that requested this email address these email addresses
Their
be set
job
up.
is to ensure, in all respects, both the provision of the briefing, IT systems, offices and all the rest of it. They think through all the steps that will be needed for a returning minister, a different minister in a coalition government, a new minister in a Labor government, should that have been the case. So their job is to prepare for all eventuality. Obviously, it's a very small team. Information on this was very tightly held, but the judgment that was made that in order to be equally ready to serve an elected government, whatever its complexion, this was something that we needed to do.
Were other preparations made for an incoming Labor government? Were briefings planned? Were offices set aside? Was hardware put aside?
We were prepared for, as we need to be, for a re-elected coalition government or a newly elected Labor government, and we were equally prepared in both respects.
That doesn't tell me about resources. What resources had been put aside in preparation for a change of government?
Could you be a bit more specific, Senator? I'm
Was
interested to know.
IT hardware allocated and set up? Were briefings scheduled? Were meetings planned?
Well, we always have a schedule of possible of things that we would do.
Okay, so
with
what are
an
they?
incoming government. Well, we had IT equipment ready for a returning or a change of government. You have to understand, Senator, if on the Sunday you have a new minister, and this is the case across the public service, they need phones, they need IT equipment. In this instance, we limited it obviously to an incoming minister and a potential chief of staff or advisor, but we were ready to go, as we always need to be, for a larger setup if there had been a change. That I don't think any Australian government would expect differently from their departments.
A degree of preparation makes sense. It's just interesting that rather than leaving a title blank or putting even a shadow minister in as a temporary placeholder, that the title minister was used. But without getting hung up on that, let me ask this. Was there any request made from Shadow Minister Wong's office for those provisions to be set up?
No, Senator.
Was any request made from members of her team?
No, Senator.
The Labor transition to government team?
I had no contact with the Labor transition to government team.
And was it requested by the then Leader of the Opposition?
I had no contact with the then Leader of the Opposition.
So it's, just in conclusion, it's your evidence that what I'd suggest is the unusual step of using public resources to set up the early infrastructure of office for a person you did not know whether would be either elected or in this portfolio or somewhere else, was a step taken without a request being made from that person for you to do so.
Senator, with the greatest of respect, could I please again set aside the idea that public resources were inappropriately used? The public service takes very seriously its impartiality and the need to serve an elected Australian government of the day. We make preparations to do that. Of course, we need to do preparations. We need to undertake preparations to do that. I would always rather that we be criticised for being forward-leaning than on the back foot.
Sure. I'm just simply concerned with the perception that it might have been a reflection of partiality rather
Well,
than
I can
impartiality.
assure
but
you, Senator, that there was no sense whatsoever of impartiality, of of partiality, that as much effort as I've said went into the preparation of the policy and practical content for both briefs. That is a function of our system, and it would be something that I hope the department would always be forward leaning on.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Senator Wong.
Well, first, just on that, in the absence of the Minister doing so, I just want to say that this department and this secretary have a very fine reputation for political impartiality, and many of the officers, including the secretary, have served governments of both political persuasions and prime ministers of both political persuasions, and I think they reflect that in the way they behave.
That's very
All
reassuring.
right, do we have questions?
Yes, I
Senator?
do.
Good.
And I would hope that the Minister would join me in making such remarks.
My views are very clear on this matter, Senator.
Thank you.
I've never doubted the department's...
Thank you. It's a pity that some of your backbenchers appear to be prepared to...
Enough of that, please.
Anyway,
Senator Wong.
should not have been
Questions?
allowed. Okay. We were discussing the core